So Latoya, thank you very much for joining us today. Latoya Peterson, the other day I said she's a journalist, but she said, well, not anymore. So I don't know, how do you identify yourself? She was a journalist, or does work as a journalist, but she's done a lot of also work as a technologist and developer, I guess, or helping develop games. And she has some impressive list of accomplishments. And when I asked her what she would like to talk about today, she said systemic racism, the importance of understanding systems, and also her own experience, how she was able to go up on what she described a down escalator. So thank you very much for your time today, Latoya. And please, you can start.
Teresa, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all to the center first and foremost, and then I believe Les K as well, for kind of opening up the space in this talk series. I'm always really impressed when people want to kind of take it deeper around conversations of race and racism. It's been a focus of my work for the last 15 years, and it's something that, you know, we're very passionate about. We're seeing a historic level of change in this particular summer. I'm not sure why that's different than any other summer that happened before this. It's interesting, these like racial involved incidents tend to rise in the summer. You can also see this back in like the last, you know, huge uprising like this, the what they were calling Freedom Summer. Like there's always this weird correlation between like the heat rising and then starting to see more of these incidents play out in public. But this year has felt very different. We saw global interest in Black Lives Matter, global protests. People really seem like they want to dig in and do more change. And so it's been interesting to see the types of conversations come out. I didn't expect an invitation from a Buddhist center to come and do this. And it was definitely not on the bingo card for 2020. But you know, Teresa's been a longtime friend and also Knight Fellow at Stanford, where, you know, I was class of 2012, so I used to live out in the same area. Very familiar with Mountain View and the surrounding areas, and also very familiar with some of the diversity issues that come even from, you know, some of these liberal enclaves that we tend to be in. So I thought that it'd be a little bit fun to tie some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about back to Buddhism. I am not actually a Buddhist by any ways or means. I'm a Christian. However, I grew up with no religion. And when I was seeking, trying to figure out if I wanted something, Buddhism was actually a very strong thing. Ultimately, I decided I believed in a soul and not necessarily not having a soul. So that kind of disqualified. But I felt like the lessons were very interesting. And I'll get into that more into the introduction piece of the talk. So this talk is designed to be very accessible. The idea is that, you know, nothing is going to be super, super complicated or high level. If it is, I'll break it down and explain it. If you have any questions, feel free to use the little reaction button and just put, you know, put a hand up or something so I know to stop. You can feel free to also drop things in the chat. All right. And then afterward, we should have plenty of time for Q&A, and we can take the conversation wherever you guys feel. Because I know that sometimes it can be very hard to have honest conversations about race, especially if you're in an area that has like slightly less diversity, or if you don't have those kind of trusting spaces set up where people feel like they can be honest. All right, so let's start. I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see it and present. So after Teresa reached out to me, I thought about, you know, what was the core concept? What is the idea of this talk, right? And I've been in a yoga practice for about 14 years now. Yoga borrows from various traditions, particularly Western yoga. There's all kinds of things tied up into it, including issues of like cultural appropriation. It's a lot that we can discuss. But I always really liked some of the core concepts that they would discuss, including Ahimsa, the idea of non-harming. And for a Buddhist context and Buddhist structure, I think Ahimsa is kind of the opposite of racism, right? It's this thing that is causing so much harm globally that in some ways it makes sense to try to align missions and understand that like a big obstacle to remove to, you know, reducing harm or stopping harm is this kind of global scourge of racism. So who am I? First, I'll talk before I talk about my own particular background, versus with Buddhism. So I've always been kind of interested in different types of belief systems. I took all kinds of courses on like comparative religions and ideas. Why do people believe what they believe? Why do people come to believe the things that they are taught? Particularly if you grew up in the United States, the founding religion is Calvinism, which is interesting. I was like, we're a Christian nation. We were a Calvinist nation, but okay, we'll talk about that later. But if you start trying to open up to other schools of thought, other interests, and it's why many of you have probably ended up here, you start to learn that there's different ways in which you can frame reality and understanding how we ask ourselves the big questions. And for me, it's been interesting. It's been a consistent line of, I would say, Buddhist influenced thought, Buddhist influenced thinking around a lot of the ways in which I was trying to make sense of life and reality. So initially, I'm from Washington, D.C., as I mentioned at the top of the call. D.C. has 3 distinct music scenes that we are known for. First one is go-go, which is not really broken outside of DC. Most people don't really know what it's like. If you remember the 1960s, that go-go movement is a little bit separate than this one, which is more heavily percussive. And that is considered, in DC, kind of like our citywide music form. The other big music form is punk rock, and punk rock music in particular. So Bad Brains is from DC, Fugazi is from DC, Henry Rollins, who's a punk rock legend, has spent considerable time here. Ian McCrae still lives here. Punk is a huge part of DC. So one time while I was at the library, just randomly browsing aisles, I saw this book over here, Hardcore Zen, Punk Rock Munch Moves, and the Truth About Reality by Brad Warner. And I had never really considered any of these things. I didn't really know what was Zen outside of that book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Never really thought about it, picked up that book, and that was functionally my first introduction to Buddhism. Now, for some people who are purists, it's a little horrifying. That's the first way that I was like, oh, this is interesting. But Brad Warner was actually part of quite a few folks who were writing from the perspective of having both a Buddhist outlook and also a punk rock outlook, and mashing together pop cultural references to explain some of the core components of Buddhism, which you see over here as well by Noah. I think Noah Levine is Dharma Punks, which is also in that same genre. So there's actually a whole genre of books that blend punk rock and Buddhism. And I read quite a few of those when I was first starting out. This photo, and it's from behind because one, I'm not really sure what happened to this person, and we haven't talked in many years, so I didn't ask. But this is actually a picture of a Japanese pen pal I used to have in 2007 named Masuo. And Masuo was a Buddhist monk. And he was on this website that were people who were seeking Japanese pen pals, spreading the word about Buddhism and trying to make friends all over the world and discuss beliefs and friendship. So he would send us photos of himself and his wife and on their travels, and send us like little snippets of Buddhism and have these conversations. This is about 2007, so probably about 2010 or 2011. Masuo was really old when I met him. He actually came to DC. We got to meet in person. And so he was probably in his 80s and I was in my 20s at the time. But these are the types of friendships that you can foster through trying to share and understand other people's perspectives and other people's beliefs. So that is kind of why I'm very interested in many ways in Buddhism and what those precepts are, what the Eightfold Path would be. In terms of my own life and work, so as Teresa mentioned, I was a journalist. I still am a journalist in my heart. In many ways, you just care about informing people, informing populace, and making sure that people have the information that they need. But I've done many other things. So now I'm kind of a storytelling technologist, and I kind of leave the form to what it is. I tell stories and I use technology to do so. So I've made documentaries about girl gamers. I used to run a site called Racialicious for 10 years. That was the intersection of race and pop culture. And we had a global audience that talked about racial issues and how they were manifesting both in the United States and also across the globe, and gave us a real understanding about issues like colonialism, issues about religious oppression and freedom, and the ways in which kind of there's all these different variations of how oppression functions in the world. But there's lots of different ways in which it manifests and it combats. A lot of times what you learn is that racism and any other form of oppression or bias, honestly, is a lot about context. And so what is considered race in America, as soon as you jump a border, it changes. What is considered race in South Africa and like the designations that they give are completely different from here. And they have a different history, different language, different words around it. It's describing the same phenomenon and operates the same way, but they are very, very different. And so when we started putting together kind of a global view of race, it's like, okay, what we were seeing is that the terms and the ideas really changed, but the overall structures did not. The way that it operated did not. And so it was able to be a resource for, until about 2015 when we were hacked, for a lot of folks who are very curious about how these systems of bias operate and then how they can resist them themselves. I did quite a bit of work also in virtual reality and augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and in machine learning. And a lot of those things are interesting because game development in particular, which is what I do now, I co-own a game studio with a friend of mine named Matu. And so what we do now is look at essentially alternate states of reality, which is what gaming is. And how do you achieve things like flow state? So it's very interesting, like the state that you try to get into with like a long meditation session or clearing your mind is very similar to the state that game developers try to create when someone is playing. So we can talk about that after the talk if you guys wish. But it's a lot of interesting similarities and conversations around kind of like these altered mind states and what you can do. And virtual reality relies a lot on those ideas of presence and altered mind states. So when I was framing up this talk, I was looking at the different sutras. I was looking at the Heart Sutra. I was like, is there something like a core idea that I could tie this back to? And then I found this quote, which when appearances and names are put away and all discrimination ceases, that which remains is the true and essential nature of things. And I was like, okay, that's dope. It's pretty profound, right? Now, I'm not going to pretend to have studied the sutra in depth. Somebody else, and all of you, I'm sure, could school me on how these sutras work and work together. But I was like, you know, this to me is really interesting, because if I look at my life story and I look at the way in which discrimination operates and frames itself, this quote, when appearances and names are put away and all discrimination ceases, is really core to the issue of what we're talking about when we talk about ending racism or ending oppression or ending suffering in general, right? It's this idea that all of these things are illusions. All of these things are clouding the picture of the essence of the person. Because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about systems of racism, right? You have allowed something else to overwrite what you see in front of you. An existing bias, an existing cognitive belief. You've allowed something else to cloud the true and essential nature of the thing that's standing in front of you. So I wanted to start with names, right? And this very interesting, sorry, my magic mouse is like jumping all over the place because it's the old version, so it's just like jumping through things. So let's start with names, right? And names are interesting because names are supposed to be an expression of who you are. The name that your parent gives you really defines and shapes a lot of how you experience the world. People frequently change their names because of some kind of transition in their lives. I am not the person I used to be, so I want to change my name. My name does not match who I feel like I am on the inside, so I'm going to change my name. There's a lot of things around names that are very powerful. In most cultures and most religious traditions, naming something is a very, very, very important rite in how we understand how we pass things through, how we convey who a person is to the world. It's a name. When you talk about names in the context of race, though, and I'll come back to my name, Latoya, in a minute. When you talk about names in the context of race, you start talking about things a little bit differently. You start seeing that corruption. Because in an ideal world, right, in the world that we're trying to get to, right, in the nirvana version of the world, a name is just a name. It's what someone gave you. But in our current version of the world, that is not the case. So there was actually quite a bit of this done. There's lots of research, but I found like the most direct version of understanding this is in the Freakonomics movie. Has anybody already seen Freakonomics, by the way, or know where this is going? Very cool. So are you familiar with Freakonomics as a franchise? Okay, so Freakonomics is actually like this you'll notice that I like the weird version of whatever something is. And so Freakonomics is kind of like two rogue economists that got together and had a New York Times column for a long time that became a book and then a movie around kind of why does the market reward certain things over others. And so they did a piece about names that I found really fascinating, because they were like, let's talk about white names versus black names. Let's put this out there. What is the difference? What is it? And so we'll talk about the way that they framed it. We'll talk about the way they frame it in the film, which I found interesting and also problematic. And then we'll talk about what that means in terms of race and racism structurally. So let's start with the first part.
As a world-renowned economist and leading expert on race in America, Fryer has long been interested in what he calls cultural segregation, the gap between white culture and black culture.
One embodiment of that culture is what you name your kid. It's probably one of the few cultural items that we can really measure precisely. What we did was we looked at the effects of your kid's first name on their life outcomes.
Dr. Fryer analyzed the naming records of every baby born in the state of California over the last 40 years, and those names tell an unmistakable story. African-American parents are more likely than any other ethnic group to give their children unique names.
There is definitely a distinction between names for white people and names for black people.
Black names we like Malik, Jaquan, Nashawn, Naheem,
Tasha and Shamika.
Shaniquas and the Nashons and the K-Shons.
I know this girl, her name is Treasure, T-R-E-C-U-R-E. Struck me as typically more African-American name.
I like the names that begin with SHA, like Shaheen, Shahid, Shamar,
Shaquem, Shakur, you know, Oprah is popular.
It was actually in the 50s and the early 60s that we saw huge overlaps in the naming patterns of Blacks and whites. So people, you know, naming their kids John, Michael, names like that. And what you saw was around in the 1968 or so, kind of the Black Power movement, actually, you saw distinct bifurcation with Black names getting more distinctively Black. And a lot of them were Islamic names because the Black Power movement was about identity. Who are we? Who are you? Are you part of us? It wasn't until the late 80s and 90s that we started to get, you know, kind of the made up, concatenated names that you see now.
This generation today, they sort of changed the whole name concept. They have names that are 30 letters long, you know, and
Now everybody tried to do something you say unique. They try to name their kid over something different.
So there's a follow-up to this, which is interesting. So you talk about African American names, and there's a lot of context, both class context, race context, and then also frequently, you know, the way in which people perceive African American names versus other types of names is derogatory, right? So as I mentioned before, my name is Latoya. I grew up as a Latoya. I've always been a Latoya. Latoya is actually interesting because it's a name that doesn't really exist anymore. It's one that's kind of started in the 1980s or so. Most people know Latoya Jackson, Michael Jackson's sister. And she, I think, was in the 70s. But it was a very unusual name then. In the 80s, Latoya really spiked. And so, you know, particularly for African-American girls born in 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, you had a really high likelihood of being named Latoya. And then after 85, that name kind of falls off the baby list. It almost completely vanishes. There's a lot more variants to Latoya. There's a Latoya, there's Latroyas, there's a lot of other things. But if you want a Latoya name, generally it now indicates that you are a young Black woman that was born between 1982 and 1986. And then, boom, it falls down, it's gone. The name Latoya also used to be considered ghetto because it was not necessarily a standard name. It wasn't a white name in the way that you saw the overlap that they explained around like Johns and Christians. And it's normally met a lot of derision. People generally felt as though if you named your child something like that, then by default you were lower class. You didn't care about, you know, proper names or real naming conventions. So there used to be a lot of discrimination around my name when I was growing up. A lot of people would automatically assume things, even when I became a professional. It was in the professional realm. People would openly say things like, oh, how would you, you know, your name is Latoya and you have this job, like why would you, what is going on? I worked with other people. There was a woman I used to work with named Shamika, and people would be openly surprised that Shamika was really well educated and very polite when they met her because they had a pre-existing idea of what a Shamika should sound like and be and participate in. What's interesting is that my name has actually evolved over time. So since it's kind of fallen out of favor, and since more and more Latoyas are in positions of power around society, it's not considered ghetto anymore. People don't make fun of that name the way that they used to, and they've moved on to other types of names that they now deem unworthy, like Dawans or Dashans or things like that, that they feel like are more ghetto now, whereas Latoya is a lot more default. There's Latoyas that work in Congress. There's Latoyas that do all kinds of things. Latoya Cantrell is now the mayor of New Orleans. So these things shift with context. But what's really interesting is that that context that comes into a name can really also start determining life outcomes. So this is the second part of the names thing, and it focuses on white names and particularly class. So I wanted to show it, but there's an interesting framework that Freakonomics does, and it's also a little risque, so I'm gonna just warn you in advance that there's some imagery that's a little out there, and we'll talk about the kind of problematic nature of the way that they're even framing
it. Today, there's more evidence than ever that the culture we come from influences the names we choose. Just ask the baby naming expert.
More and more today, you see parents choosing a name almost as if they're launching a product, that you're trying to position your child for the best chance of success in a global marketplace.
So in an oversaturated marketplace, which names garner the most attention? Are some names destined for the top shelf while others are headed for the bargain basement? Let's take a look at two different product lines. Turns out there is such a thing as a knockoff name. The top 5 middle-class white girl names from Fryer's study are, in order of popularity, Ashley, Lauren, Jessica, Emily, and Sarah. while the top 5 lower income white girl names are Brittany, Samantha, Amanda, Jessica, and Ashley. So what's happened to Ashley? She's fast losing her popularity on the middle class list, but she's #1 among the Walmart crowd. As those wealthier folks see their names popping up everywhere, they quickly discard them in favor of less common merchandise. And just like that, today's high-end Ashley becomes tomorrow's low-rent Trashly. On the lowest rung of the ladder are the names that most signify lower-class parents, like Misty, Destiny, Bobby, Brandy, or Cindy. Now, if you're over 40 and actually remember a time when these names didn't belong up here on stage, you're right. Years ago, these names wouldn't be caught dead in a place like this. But the years have not been kind to a name like Bobby, and even though she once was at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, today, she's just clinging to her former glory.
Please don't name your kid Barbie or Bambi or anything like that. They might end up being a dancer one day.
And if you do end up with a name that's bound for stripperdom, at least you can change it. I mean, hey, it works in Hollywood. Think about it. Would John Wayne have been as tough if his name was Marion Morrison? Would we think Marilyn Monroe was as beautiful if her name was still Norma Jean? And would we think of Ice Cube rushing the crowd if his name was still O'Shea Jackson?
Actually, I always wanted to change my name to Max Powers because it seems like a name that everybody, like, once they hear it, they're like, dang, this guy must be really cool. I wanted to change my name when I was younger. I never liked it.
If my name was Henry Obama, you know what I mean? I think that would mean something to people, and I would have more doors open for me.
I did want to change it, but now I'm sort of cool with it. It just sort of like jumps on your back and rides along with you through life, you know?
So I wanted to include that segment for 2 reasons. The first one is, like, Freakonomics treats things, this is one of the big problems that I have with their framework, as if they're not social constructs, as if these are determinants, right? So it's like, oh, don't name your kids this or they're going to end up in a strip club. There's nothing about that name that says strip club. There's nothing about that name that would carry those qualities or have that life journey or do those things, right? But you're acting as if this one piece is a determinant when it's not, right? And so what happens a lot of times, particularly in racial discourse, it's like, well, if Black kids wanted their kids to achieve more, they just name them something different. You would pick another name like a John or something else and not like a Latoya, right? Which is patently false, right? Your name doesn't determine the worth of the person or the outcome. But because we've attached race and class signifiers in the way that they broke down to names, people start believing that the name is a determinant and not actually societal factors and the other things, all of the other things that influence what a life is. And then more importantly, the worth that we put on those lives, right? What is wrong with working in a strip club? Many, many, many women do this. But we've decided that, okay, this is bottom of the barrel for society. Therefore, these things are undesirable. Therefore, people with these traits are also undesirable. What's also notable about that clip is how many African Americans we talked to have thought about changing their name. A lot of times when I was younger, this doesn't happen anymore now because now I have a huge professional experience from portfolio. I've been profiled in Forbes. Like, I don't have these problems any longer. Right? I'm a professional. I'm really well known in this one field, and I changed fields and it's still going pretty well for me. But when I was younger and had to open up doors, apply to jobs and things like that, recruiters just wouldn't feel like I was serious or I was good for the position because of my name. And these are people who've never met me, right? My name is on a resume that goes out over a door. You've never met me, you've never seen me. And so there's actually been tons of studies just like this one, which is Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? A field experiment on labor market discrimination, right? These things do matter. Because when we get into hiring decisions, this is where the structural part of racism comes in. A lot of times when you talk to people, they're like, well, you know, Black people have been mean to me too, or African Americans have also been mean. And this is individual acts of meanness as a definition of racism. But the larger, more pernicious thing, the thing that's much harder to fight is the structural level of racism. People who never met me made a determination based on my name because it carried race and class connotations that I was not a fit for something that I might have been qualified for. It was very difficult when I was younger to get jobs and interviews, and people would just say that outright, we're not doing it. So like I said, now, not as much a distinction. I've moved classes, things are different, but it was something that I definitely felt, and it's a piece that continues to change. for a while in my 20s, I thought about just changing my name, particularly as I started out as a writer, to L. Denise Peterson, because Denise is not a name that is race or class marked in the same way. It's gender marked, right? So people named Denise are normally female, but not anything else. And I could have had the L as the beginning of my name, which you'll see in many people, particularly in professional classes. They might have one type of name at the front and then change it. One of my good friends named LaRonda, she goes by Sine. So her name is L. Sine. But one of the things that you start to discover, and you'll notice and you heard in the video, they're going, I got used to my name. I got used to carrying it. I got used to the weight of what it was. For me, my name is a filter. If someone is not going to take me seriously because they have made a prejudgment on my name, that's probably not somebody I want to be working with anyway. Also, I don't feel like there's any particular problem with the name Latoya. I don't quite like it. It doesn't mean anything. You don't get a license plate when you're a kid, right? You don't get any of those cool things. But I didn't feel like there was any real problem with it outside of the value other people were assigning to it. So what's been interesting also about this, just to update it, some of those examples are from like 2000. So earlier this year, 2020, my friend Jenny Korn, who runs the Harvard Berkman Center's race breakout group, when we talk about race and internet and society. So Jenny was doing phone canvassing for a candidate. I don't remember which candidate it was. And she called a house and asked for somebody named Latoya and was shocked. So she posted on Facebook this long thing about how the homeowner at that house called and said, that's an N-word name. There's nobody with that name here, and hung up the phone. And how she felt so violated and shocked and hurt by that reaction. And so she's writing about it, her friends are talking about it. And I was like, Jenny, you know that's my name, right? Like, what do you think my whole life has been? That's what this is. An immediate reaction based on nothing, right? It's an illusion, and it's covering the true nature or essence of a thing. Did I get to appearances? What did I just do? Sorry. I know what happened. My magic mouse has skipped ahead on me, so forgive me. I meant to go to appearances first, but we can go to this. Appearances. So let's talk about appearances and talk about why. Do you guys recognize who's on the screen? These are two shooters from recent memory. This man is Dylan Roof, who came into a church in Charleston and murdered 9 parishioners who had gathered for prayer because he believed it was the beginning of a race war and it was the way to spark one within the United States, to go in and unpromptedly attack a Black church. And then this is the Kenosha shooter, Kyle Rittenhouse, who has been radicalized online as in the way that unfortunately so many young white men are being these days. It was radicalized online and believed that he was part of a standing mission to protect against the mostly peaceful Black Lives Matter protests. And so to him, the sign of graffiti was a sign of, a reduction in order, which you're hearing a lot of rhetoric, particularly from the Trump administration around this, and that he needed to take matters into his own hands. And so he shot a protester, to shoot 2 more. What's interesting about their treatment is that both of these men have committed crimes, both. They were documented, they admitted them, they called, they left a paper trail, all of these things. And in each case, the police treated them with almost deference. In Dylan Roof's case, he was arrested. They walked him out nicely. They gave him a bulletproof vest in case anyone wanted to take a shot at him. He said he was hungry. They stopped on the way to the precinct and gave him Burger King. In Kyle Rittenhouse, he is the confirmed shooter. Everybody, he said it online. He called his friend and said, hey, I killed somebody. He's the confirmed shooter. He is not in custody. He is at his house. And he did not show up for his initial hearing, to which the judge said, okay, and just pushed it. They didn't bring him back in. They didn't have a bail. There's no manhunt. This is a convicted, an alleged killer. Fine. What is the difference? Why were they treated differently than so many other people who have committed that same crime? And on the flip side, you have 2 other figures here, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging or sleeping in her house, who was jogging or sleeping in her house, neither of whom had been accused of a crime, neither of whom were doing anything out of the ordinary of their days. There was essentially a warrant was issued, which was called a no-knock warrant in Breonna Taylor's case, where officers enter the house that they suspect, and they can just go in guns blazing because they assume the suspect is armed and dangerous. The problem was that was not Breonna Taylor. It was the warrant was for the wrong house. They came in as intruders, did not announce themselves as law enforcement. Her, fiance at the time stood up and tried to figure out who was intruding on their house, and the police started firing. Fired all these rounds, killed her in her bed when she was sleeping. So you've seen calls around the nation for Black Lives Matter. Oprah Magazine put Breonna Taylor on the cover. There's been a movement to arrest those police officers who were involved. But so far, nothing has really happened. These officers have not been charged or declined to be charged. And you see this time and time again in officer-involved cases around particularly African Americans, that they won't be charged, that there won't be anything that happens. Ahmaud Arbery is actually a much more awful miscarriage of justice, where two men who were not affiliated in any way with law enforcement decided he looked suspicious, pursued him, hunted down the gun, and then shot him. He was deceased for about 2 months when the person who shot the video, who recorded the pursuit and the capture and the eventual murder of Ahmaud Arbery, turned that video over to law enforcement and then made the video public after 2 months when he realized these men weren't being charged. And even now, they still have not brought the amount of charges that are necessary for what was essentially a cold-blooded murder. So again, why was this different? Why is the appearance, the skin color, the tone of the person change the outcome so dramatically in a nation where we have laws and allegedly rule of law to deal with these things? Dylann Roof and Kyle Rittenhouse murdered people and were treated with the utmost respect and kindness that should have been afforded to Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, who were not in any way, shape, or form involved in criminal activity. But this will happen, and this starts to play out in the same way that the George Zimmerman trials, when he murdered Trayvon Martin, started to play out, where the referendum became not about what happened, which is really clear cut. Again, this is the illusion of racism. This is clouding the essential nature of the thing. A vigilante decided to shoot someone because they felt like it, essentially, because they felt scared or whatever. There was no real justification to do so. And instead, because of the skin color of the person involved, it becomes a referendum on varying things. With George Zimmerman, it was the Castle Doctrine. I can't wait to see what it's going to be with Ahmaud Arbery. But of various things that actually were immaterial to what happened. The rule is you don't take someone else's life because you feel like it. You can't murder someone in cold blood. We have a lot of laws around this. You can't kill somebody because you feel like it. So why is this suspended when it comes to Black lives? So let's talk about the nature of things and how we kind of got to this place. So I grew up very low income and very poor. And it's a really interesting the way in which people perceive you in one socioeconomic class versus another. If you're in a place like Mountain View, which is very, very affluent, people start to assume that kind of like, well, we're privileged. This is kind of more or less the life that everybody else has. And it is absolutely not. It's the opposite. For most of my educational career, I bounced around from school to school. My parents had moved into one of the better school districts. And so I spent my high school years at first in the worst performing school in the best district in the area. And then I moved to the best performing school in the worst district in the area. And it was really interesting to see how different life and expectations were. In the worst performing school, there was still an expectation everyone was going to college, that there were jobs and careers that you could sign up for. There's all these other things, and that, you know, maybe if school wasn't free, you can get a trade. There were all of these resources available, all these things available to help you on your path. Whereas I was kind of amazed and stunned when I transferred to the other school. And just basic things like, oh, are you going to take an AP test? Well, you're probably not going to do too well, but you should try anyway. It's a good practice. That would have never, ever, ever been said at my old school, right? The idea was that you were going to take this AP test, you're going to get a 3 or higher, you try to aim for a 5 because you can do it. Whereas the messaging that we got in this other school was like, well, this is really hard and it's not really for you, but it's good to try because, you know, you can see that there might be something better. It's a really interesting way to start looking at the way the society constructs how they talk to different types and ideas of different types of children and what they say you can or cannot be. And so, you know, as I became a professional, I started moving up the ranks. I started to do more work with different types of scholars and educators and city planners, particularly around gentrification. I came across this really interesting study. And this is at this point old, right? So they've done one follow-up study and then the funding for GIS mapping kind of vanished, so they haven't done another study like this since. But the Kirwan Institute on Race, which was out of Ohio State University, did a GIS mapping in the field of social equity and advocacy, which is really, really fascinating. So they used maps and mapping data to look at structural inequality. And I love this so much because it explains so many of the things that you're trying to take as separate, like educational outcomes, access to jobs, access property taxes, things like that, and puts them all in one huge report where they overlaid the maps to show what became their ultimate thesis, that there's areas of high and low opportunity, and those things are determinant of your life outcomes. You might have heard different politicians talk about this. Condoleezza Rice has been actually a really strong advocate of discussing children and zip codes. And it's interesting because she's on the Republican side of the aisle about school choice. So most people don't assume that she's talking about inequality, but she's actually been one of the most outspoken governmental critics, one of the highest up governmental critics of the school systems that we have, where she notes that, I shouldn't be able to look at a child's zip code and have a sense of what they're going to attain in their life. But that is what we set up. So this GIS study is really fantastic. It's still available for free. I highly recommend, if you have a chance, to go look through it to understand what they call opportunity areas, which we'll get into. So they do a special breakout on space and social equity, which is really pressing, particularly in the Mountain View, Palo Alto area, especially when we think about East Palo Alto and the ways in which the resources and things that flow out of places like Stanford and out of the city and functions somehow do not make it in the same way to East Palo Alto, and what that means to maintain these two spaces so close together. But they talk a lot about space and social equity, and how racial and social inequity often manifest as spatial inequity. There was, I think last year, someone had done a beautiful data visualization of race by geography, essentially like, home ownership and where in different cities do people live. And it's a very stunning and stark show of this division. And so, as they know, maps are the best tools to display this kind of spatial phenomena, and they link community sharing different problems. So I was like, this is a really, really smart way of approaching it. And so they talk about opportunity clusters. And when they shared this framework, this whole part of the beginning side of my life snapped into focus, where I went, oh my gosh, this is exactly what happened to me. This is why my life is different than the lives of my friends and my cousins, why I was able to attain so much more, even though by background, like I didn't actually go to college, I didn't get a college degree. They're all the things that you would normally do to climb the ladder of success, I did not do. But I grew up in what they would call an opportunity zone. And so they note opportunity really matters. And it's this, they define it as a situation or condition that places individuals in a position more likely to succeed or excel. And they look at the factors of that: high quality education, a healthy and safe environment, stable housing, sustainable employment, political empowerment, outlets for wealth building, positive social networks. And so when I looked at the lives of like my friends who did not necessarily get to move on or do other types of things in their lives, when I look at my cousins who had very different lives than I did, even though we grew up less than 3 miles from each other, a lot of it comes down to these opportunities and spaces, right? Did I have access to a higher quality education than they did? We speak differently. Even though we're from the same family, we spent many, many years together, and we are only 3 miles apart. The DC and Maryland borders are very close from where I was. But the educational system was so much higher in the environment that I was versus my cousin's schools, where because the school buildings were in such disrepair, they were always out of school when we were kids. Like it snowed one year and the roof fell in and they didn't have the money to fix it. So the kids were just out of school for like 2 weeks. Nobody said anything, it just was, right? Like that would have never happened in Montgomery County where I grew up in DC. That was normal, right? The buildings were just in disrepair. And that's before you got to what was happening inside the classroom, right? Healthy and safe environment. My cousins grew up ducking gunshots and there were bullet holes every place that they lived, right? And while I was considered in a rough area of this very rich suburb, we could generally walk around on the streets and not really fear for our lives or have any big problems. We had a lot of green space. It was easy when I became a teenager to go find places to go work and get like a part-time job as a teenager because economic opportunity was pretty plentiful out there. There was always somebody with a Subway shop or a little store or something that would hire a teenager, whereas in my cousin's area, a lot of those jobs did not exist. They didn't want to hire you, and frequently you were competing with adults for the same jobs. Stable housing, right? In Montgomery County, they had, and this is interesting, when I went to research it later as an adult, I was like, why was our area so diverse? Well, there's a super long racist history of what's called redlining, where they banned African Americans from living in certain areas in Montgomery County. And in the 60s, they went, oh, okay, we have to fix this. And so Montgomery County, Maryland, which is normally on the list of the most diverse cities in America every single year, we normally have one of the top spots. So where I grew up in Silver Spring, used to be the highest one. Now it's Gaithersburg and Germantown, which are about 30 minutes up the road. It's like cheaper housing now. So those now normally top the most diverse cities in America list. And one of the big reasons for that is the housing policies that we had here. And the housing policies were designed, again, after the very racist redlining period to try to integrate as much as possible. So in the place that I grew up, in the apartment complex that I grew up in, depending on where you lived, so there are a bunch of structures all together, they're in the same like area. Depending on if you were across one street or across another street or at one or another end, you went to a completely different high school. And so that is, again, like a descendant of busing, this idea of trying to economically integrate different types of schools. And so the school district map were kind of like a star, and you would be bused to these various schools to try to blend different types of economic diversity together so that it wasn't kind of essentially these poverty holes that sometimes are created where they just throw everybody in the same place and just say, okay, fight it out, we're not going to give you anything. So it's a really interesting thing. Political empowerment is also important, but we can get to that a little bit later. And outlets for wealth building, this idea that, you know, you might be in this one place, but there are people around you, there's opportunity around you to change and to do different things. And so what they found, and this is the thing that Teresa referred to at the beginning of the call, was that ultimately, if you grow up in these high opportunity areas, going to be successful is like riding the up escalator to success, to reach opportunity. And it's the idea that, like, yes, you know, you might have to exert some effort. If you want to go faster on your journey, you would need to walk or run up the escalator, but eventually, given enough time, you will get to a better place. In the presentation that they gave specifically, so it's not this slide is from the report that's open and available on the internet. And the presentation they gave, they had a third marker, something in between, which is the stairs. And they said, you know, most people are walking up the stairs. It's going to require some effort to get to where you want to go. But if you're in like a normal level opportunity area and you exert some effort, you will be able to rise, you'll be able to get up there. But others, particularly people in what they call low opportunity areas, are running up the down escalator to get to what they want. So even if you're exerting tremendous amounts of willpower, tremendous amounts of effort, if you slip, if you fall, if something goes wrong, you are being pulled back down. And that visual has really always stayed with me because it's such a description around kind of how these things work in America, how race and class work, where for some folks, it's an up escalator. And if you're on the up escalator, it's going to be really hard for you to see what the issues are for people who are in a different perspective. Whereas if you were like me and you had to run up the down escalator, the world looks and operates and feels totally different in many different ways. And a lot of that, again, is around the ways in which we allocate resources as a society, the ways in which our government functions, the ways in which we look at education and educational outcomes, the ways in which we fund education, the ways in which we invest in our own citizens, and the ways in which you make determinations about people based on essentially what you think their potential is, and again, not the true essence of the person. So that's it for essentially the slides. I wanted to leave a generous amount of time for Q&A and conversation and questions. But you know, the biggest thing again is I believe that for folks in your position, looking at these principles that, you know, every single day is a new way, a new practice to trying to understand and grow more, and realizing that racism is a thing that is antithetical to your beliefs. And as a result, there's so many different ways of constructing society. We have allowed an illusion to cloud the true essence or true nature of a thing. So thank you. That's the scripted, like more produced part of this. And then now we're in Q&A.
Thank you, Latoya, for a wonderful presentation. If anybody has a question, I think Dave has a question. Please, Dave.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk, Latoya. Not only lots of good information conveyed, but I feel like I've got questions buzzing around in my head like a bunch of bees here. So I'll try to limit myself to at least one or two. Your description of given names, I thought was fascinating. Years ago, I had a friend named J.J. Card who was a research scientist and had the experience of going to conferences and having their papers, have preceded them. And so they would finally meet face to face with people who had these expectations, having read the papers and seen the name J.J. Card, that they were just, their mouths were hanging open because she was an Asian woman. And very much resonates with what you were saying about preconceptions based on names. But I wanted to point out, I don't know if you're familiar with this work, there's a book that I've just gotten and started reading called The Sun Also Rises, where sun is spelled S-O-N. And in this particular case, what they're doing is research on the truth or myth of social mobility, and the proxy that they use there is not given name, but surname. And to look at the basic thesis of the book is we have this idea that individuals, with or without the consideration of race, have all of this wonderful social mobility and the whole Horatio Alger thing and all of that, and that in fact this is essentially a myth. And when you consider that in terms of discussions like, oh, slavery ended 150 years ago and racism ended, 20 years ago, and it's all okay now, and people should just go out and, make their own way in the world. This stuff resonates down generation after generation after generation. And you get into the whole idea of like reparations and so forth, and people say, well, I didn't own any slaves, so that shouldn't be an issue, right? This book just really makes a very strong case for the idea that you have to consider this over very long periods of time in order to really
I mean, that's amazing. I'm putting it on my reading list. I just looked it up, ooh, because I've generally focused on first names, right, and given names, particularly also because African-American surnames have specific histories, and there are a lot of different types of ones. So like Jackson, which is considered which is used by a lot of African Americans, is actually after founding father, and a lot of times people change their names after being freed. So like on my family side in South Carolina, they are Priestleys, and that was a very intentional name. It's like, I'm not going to have my slave owner's name. I am now free. I am of Christ. I'm going to name my name Priestley, right, specifically. I don't know how the Peterson side of my name came in, or the Miller side of my dad's side of the family came in, because again, some of those records do not exist, right? And some of those records do not exist. Why? Because they were destroyed. The whole idea of slavery was to destroy and separate you from your surname. But I also love that idea and this framework, because again, like this idea of who you are and who you are as a family continuing through. When I started changing classes and got into kind of like these more, I would say, elite circles, it's interesting to be like, oh, like I was talking to someone, we unfortunately, there's another group that I'm in, the Japan group, Teresa, of fellows, and we had someone that unfortunately committed suicide. And there was another fellow that had the same profile that committed suicide. So we were talking about that within our group about why this happened. But it was interesting because everyone kept saying, oh, well, they're from this great family. And I was like, in America, we don't really have the same class structure. So what do they keep talking about? This great family, this great family. Oh, well, her family was part of folks who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And his family is old line. So I was like, oh, wow. So this stuff does still persist in so many different ways, right? And again, like part of this guy's suicide was the weight of those expectations. Well, in our family, we do this, and we have done this for 7 generations, and we will always do this. And if you cannot do this, you have been a failure. So I'm not, in terms of surnames, I have not actually looked into that at all, but I'm really fascinated to see what's going on. All right, I think we have a question from Travis.
Yeah.
Hi, Latoya. Thanks a lot for coming and talking with us today. Big Fugazi fan. In fact, I sample music, and Teresa, I sent you that sample of Suzuki Roshi with it was actually, do you know who Kamaya is?
Kamaya, I do not. I've heard the name, but I don't know.
This is on the top, this Fugazi album was on the top of my desk. I was going to sample the Waiting Room, the intro to Waiting Room. When I was a teenager, loved it. And, Henry Rollins too. And actually it like helped me kind of understand, gender relations, and people don't often know that about like DC's like had like the punk rock scene had kind of a social consciousness to it. A lot of people can't get over the noise of it, but gosh, where to start? I feel like, well, first of all, my name's low class, at least it was when I was younger. But it was a name that could be both white or black. I grew up in the Midwest and, working class parents. And when I left for the military at age 18, I didn't change my last name, my surname, but I changed the pronunciation of it. So the first day I showed up for basic training, I was no longer Marsat, which I'd been plagued with my whole life. I'm like, okay, I'm going to recover some of my French heritage. I'm going to be Marceau. So don't say the T. And this is going to sound funny. My tennis coach would terrorize me. For 2 years, he was the only guy, because I went and did the recruiting visit, and met my dad, and he was from California, and he had a similar French name, but he never dropped the T, and so he just went at me over and over. What's your name? What's your name? And I'd be like, it's Marceau. It's Marceau. Say it. But the military is interesting because it gave me a little bit of like visibility out to another life. And one of the most significant things I could do to get on the up escalator was to find a way to get to California. And when I was in California, the rules changed slightly. We were talking, some of the students at Kannon were talking recently about writing letters back to swing states, which, where I'm from, and writing letters and basically encouraging people to vote. And I was telling another student last week, I'm like, I don't need to do that because I'm on a call with, and sometimes up to 100 people from Southern Ohio every day at work. And this is my reality. And so what I say and do with these groups of people that are more like, have more of the background that I grew up with, is going to have way more impact than any kind of letter I write. It's just, they're going to see who I am and think about that when they go in, to vote in the fall. There's so much I could say. I mean, like, Kamaya is like, I listened to this Oakland rapper that's got like she's just the rhythm, her flow, like her lyrical flow is so great. And at the same time, like I've been listening to like Billie Eilish's like most recent stuff, which is more jazz oriented. But these are two like very successful musicians. One's white, one's black, and what their lyrics are saying, their reality is so different. And I think, music is such a great like means to kind of understand the life of people, even people that live in the same place, but you can start to understand like, how hard it can be to navigate the world, and how a little break here and there can change lives. Like, Dave and I, like, we do talk about this a lot, like in other talks, like upward mobility. Is it a myth? Is it real? It's somewhere in between. But the last thing I want to say is, it's very interesting structurally. The military. I was at the Air Force Academy, and the Air Force Academy was founded in the mid-50s, and it started out as 4 squadrons, and now there's 40. And if you look at the names of the squadrons, you can see a trend where like the names change as you get into the social revolution of the 60s. And so on my uniform, this was my squadron.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. 1968, the Black Panthers. And that was what I wore on my athletic jacket for 2 years. And the way that these social like cues like structure and the way that it projects a meaning to someone, there would be like an arbitrary convention of that. And you'd have like the conversations about like this squadron's like this, the squadron's like that, totally arbitrary, totally illusory. And you know, that sutra quote you were talking about like hits home for me. That's like right up the Zen alley of you know, nothing necessarily substantial to it. It's a complete fabrication. And to the extent, like, you know, I hear Billie Eilish and I'm like, well, she has the same name as Billie Holiday, but is that appropriation? I don't know. You know, like, she's a beautiful jazz singer. Her parents were very socially conscious entertainers in LA. She at some point she was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that like dyed her hair black and got really, you know, started making more depressive music. And now she's got a Grammy and she's like so successful she has to like sing about like, I'm gonna try to be happier. And then, you know, you got like, I come back to Kamaya, who, you know, I listen to all the time, and she had a busted record deal. Like her family like screwed her. Like she was trying to involve them in her career, and she's rapping about the hustle, you know, the hustle mentality, and it's a totally different reality. And you know, I just feel like there's very few people that really get that, like how different your like reality can be, you know, if you don't know what it's like if I don't make the right choices, I'm done. Like that survival thing can be so strong, and in places like Mountain View, folks can sort of like they can understand it intellectually but not viscerally, I guess. Yeah. So
absolutely, that was a great comment. So many things to unpack there. I'll try to go with the reality and change because I love the Kamaya example, then like a little note in the music, and then come back to the military. Because I was like, you said so many things, and particularly like, I also love that whole deal. Like this guy's like, oh, what's your name, right? Because again, the name that you choose for yourself is how you're presenting yourself to the world. And is he putting on airs? You look like me. How dare you think you're better than me? What did you say your name was? Like, it's interesting because you can hear these things play out, right? Time and time. If you hear these things play out, and the same people are like, oh, let me just expose your real name. Oh, Master P, AKA Percy, right? Like there's all of the stuff around dominance around names that it's really fascinating. Anyway, so first the hustle. So that's a really interesting thing for you to have point out and illuminate, because like, yes, like what makes one artist work and do things better than other artists? And then particularly we have this, what we currently call kind of like blackfishing, where you're seeing all of these artists that are taking on like the style and sometimes like skin tone and the hair texture of African Americans where they don't have that culture to try to be more popular. So like there's artists like Bad Barbie and like Rita Ora. Rita Ora is like an Albanian immigrant who is like coming out in box braids and pretends that she's like, well, it's a really interesting phenomenon. Cultural appropriation is even more tricky because it doesn't, in all the work that I've done around race and racism, it doesn't actually look at the nuances of shared culture and what happens when people live close together, which is kind of like the integrative ideal, where it's like if you grow up in areas where you're not, quote, supposed to be, you will adopt things from those areas. And as long as it's not necessarily you adopting someone else's culture, but might be normal to you. So the framework that I like to use, I say cultural appropriation because some people have heard of it, but it's actually a really great thing I learned from my friend's blog. It was Mimi and Minha who did this blog called Threadbare. It was about the politics of fashion. And Mimi in particular has a piece about Riot Girl and the punk fashions of appropriation that everybody should read. It's really, really cool. But they were challenged. They had written a piece about a Beth Ditto nylon spread, where Beth Ditto, she's a rock artist. I guess I can call her rock. But Beth Ditto was doing this fashion spread and literally was using women of color as like maids, as backdrops, just decoration for her shoot. And this happens all the time in fashion editorials, right? So Mimi and Minha did a piece about it, and someone came back and they're like, well, you clearly didn't see the art that was referenced here. You don't know art, not knowing that Mimi is an art historian. She's that universe, like she was like, let me tell you about art, right? And just dropped this amazing series, right? And she introduces this term called the violence of revulsion, which is the thing that I like to use. It's not necessarily that we might acquire things from other people's cultures that we feel like speak to us or have personal meanings or things like that. It's more the violence of revulsion is my thing on me considered gross, strange, weird, ghetto, But on a white body or on you, it is interesting, exotic, different. It's, oh yes, Bo Derek pioneering cornrows in the movie 10. No, that's what are you talking about? But it's beautiful on Bo Derek. It's not beautiful on all these Black people who've been wearing cornrows for thousands of years, right? So this idea of the violence of revulsion, to me, is a much more helpful framework, whereas it's not the item itself, it's not the thing, it's what does this mean to me? And how do people perceive me? So like my co-founder Mittu is South Asian, she's Bangladeshi British. And she had a long fight with herself about whether or not she wanted to get a nose piercing. And now, I mean, like, again, this is 2020, right? Everyone and their mom has a nose piercing, you got septum rings, it's all kinds of stuff. But in her specific context and growing up in the UK, that was considered a sign of kind of like, you know, this Daisy girl, she's fresh off the boat, she's not this, she's not that, she's not sophisticated. And the more elaborate and culturally appropriate jewelry for her that she saw everybody wear was stigmatized. And so she has this whole rant about Gwen Stefani and like the people who take these items and suddenly they're beautiful and exotic, where you made fun of me for wearing them, where you made fun of me for eating that, where you made fun of me for this tradition, and now suddenly it's cool because you're doing it. So I find that framework, the violence of revulsion, to be super instructive and helpful when we evaluate kind of like how we're moving in the world. Because again, is it about the item or the value that we can give this item and the ways in which we are using this item? So that's a piece there. In terms of the music that you were talking about, and Kamaya and Billie Eilish. So I was a music writer a long time ago. That's where I started my career. And funnily enough, I think Teresa had asked, like, what's my relationship with Japan? I was researching the history of American hip hop and came across in like 2000 this paper. I could not find it for the life of me because it's the origin story paper, so I want to get it and reread it. There is some scholar at some random library, when I was just looking in the research library, had argued that hip hop got to Japan because of the Zainichi, which is like the oppressed Korean minority within Japan. And that's why hip hop culture took off so strongly, which a lot of my friends who are not Japanese scholars are like, that's total bullshit. I was like, what are you talking about? But that was the paper I read. And I was like, wait a minute. So how did this piece of me, how did hip hop get to Japan in the first place? What is that? At one point, Japan was the largest exporter of hip hop culture outside of America. There's a Japanese version of The Source. There's Japanese hip hop. When I went 2 years ago, we found Japanese trap rappers in the Tower Records, right? Like they have, like the aesthetic keeps changing and it keeps moving. So I've been listening to Japanese rap for like 20 years. And I'm going, okay, how did these things come together? How did they collide? What is the cultural focus of this? What was the sharing? What was the appeal? What is the thing in art that made me so, okay, I see you and I recognize you. As a person that grew up in these environments that were, and sometimes very violent, sometimes ghetto, like gangster rap, and the fascination, particularly of like white suburban kids in gangster rap, has always been intriguing to me. So I'm like, what are you getting out of this? Like, what is the thing, what in the piece of this art is speaking to you? And there's a lot of different reasons, right? Like you find different things that you love in different pieces, right? In a way that punk isn't my usual genre, but I grew up around it, I like it, I'm familiar with it. There's songs that I really like that spoke to something of me, so what is it? So it's weird, I was reading, it's a long time ago, this guy who used to write for the New Yorker, John Seabrook, had written a book called No Brow, which is interesting because when we talk about highbrow and lowbrow, there's actually a huge racist history of even those terms, right? This idea of like what your facial structure looks like, therefore your intellectual attainment. It's really interesting. But anyway, John Seabrook wrote this book called No Brow. That was about the blending. This is back in like 2004 or 5. I bought it from an Olson's bookstore. That's how old that is. So I have to go back and look at the publication. I don't think Olson's exists anymore, much less most bookstores, but whatever. So I was reading this guy from the New Yorker, and he was talking about walking around the New Yorker offices, which I would consider is like the height of privilege in America, right? Like you are at these literary establishments in New York City. And he was talking about playing gangster rap, right? He's like, nobody's gonna fuck with me. And I read that and I was like, what is happening at the New Yorker? Like, what is going on? Where he's like, I'm a buzz Big Papa while I walk in to this meeting with my editor. And I was just like, what is this? But it's a really fascinating idea of kind of like, why do people feel like they relate to stuff? So Billie Eilish was actually under some criticism around a kind of appropriation of 90s hip hop culture, because that's her image and her look until recently. A lot of the stuff was inherited from TLC. They're like, so how can people love and eat it up when it's Billie Eilish? And when it was TLC, and they're not winning those awards or being seen in the same way. And you've seen this fight actually keep playing out again and again and again at the Grammys, because what happens is that Black creators generally get the short shift against like a popular white creator, to the point where it started to get really egregious. One year it was Macklemore winning over Kendrick Lamar, and Kendrick Lamar won a journalist award for that album. Which one was it? It wasn't to Pimp a Butterfly. He won a Polk.
Yeah, yeah.
To talk about
Yeah,
like
he won a Pulitzer.
And he won
a Pulitzer.
He won a Polk first, then he won a Pulitzer. Because I was like, he won a Polk, then he won for this album. But the winning award went to Macklemore for Thrift Shop, and everybody was like, okay,
right?
How did this happen?
The Vanilla Ice of his day, yeah.
Yeah, it was like nobody's thinking about Macklemore, right? But it's like, but that one, there was like, how did the Academy do this? And so there was a huge uproar. And then the next year, Adele went over Beyonce's Lemonade, and Adele was on stage accepting the award, like, thank you, but did you see what Beyonce just did? Like, guys.
And when Beck won over Beyonce too, people were upset. You know, that was like, hey, come on. And I just talked about Beck, you know, a couple months ago, and like the sincerity of his music. But yeah, it plays out on these very public stages. And you know, I think about, like, as you're talking, when I first started listening to West Coast rap, and like it was probably like late, about the same time as Fugazi. And the reason that like I was probably attracted to it was I spent a summer with my aunt in East Hollywood, and she like lived in a row house, and like you would walk down the street to the Fat Burger, and there'd be like bulletproof glass on the wall. And, you know, like I'm 12 years old, and at the same time, like I'd never seen the ocean. So we would get in her car and drive to Malibu or something. And it's just mind blowing to a Midwesterner. And I can remember we didn't have a VCR at home. So we would rent videos every day at Blockbuster. And we watched The Untouchables. I don't know if you remember that, like Kevin Costner and like Robert De Niro. And it's like this romanticized like movie about Al Capone and gangsters. And it's like, what is the like security that someone derives from seeing like a historical gang of white men that, like, when you go to an American city where organized crime is an issue, it just somehow it stops people, right? And I can remember like thinking, like, when I started to see then like really like Snoop Dogg had that like same lyricism that I love about Kamaya. He was really one of, like you were talking about the flow state, and like in terms of hip hop culture, I think when it really took off was when there was that level of just like proficiency in rapping, where you have both sort of an extemporaneous, but you have like the perfect lyrical flow, and it becomes beautiful then, and really like it has a lilt and a nuance to it, and there's melody that is also accompanied with like time signatures changes, and just beautiful like organic sort of sounding, like it tells a story, right? That part of it was when, like, you know, the Dr. Dre album came out. That part of it was like what drew me in. But what also drew me in, because I was part of that sort of TV culture, the MTV culture, was like they would show inner city LA like in 1990, 91, something like that. And I recognized those places. And it wasn't like, it's like, that's like driving around my aunt's neighborhood, who was a working class like paralegal in LA. But I think that there's such a chasm, like a divide of experience. And what you were saying earlier about like when the names started to bifurcate in the 60s, and then people started to be less diverse, and that there's only these real like the inclusivity in zip code became the norm and not the exception. You know, my wife's from Sacramento, and we talk about this all the time, because Sacramento is more diverse in some ways than the Bay Area, but certainly it's diverse in a certain way, and it's different than I'm sure than Virginia, and much different than in the part of the Midwest. I lived in the Mississippi Valley, like at the confluence of Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, and it's such a sort of like teeter-totter of just overt racism that you encounter every day, and like people say stuff like nasty stuff, and you grow up as a kid, and it's impressionable to you, and you form a like a relationship with that at a very early age because it's in your face all the time. And I think we have the luxury in Mountain View to kind of think about it, or to have opinions about articles we read. And we would do well to like have that, if we could have that experience of what it's like for a lot of America to have to navigate both their like class struggle, but also their like relationship with the systemic racism you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know we only have a few minutes left. So is there anyone else that wanted to jump in or say something? I know that Teresa and Bonnie both have hands up.
It's Bonnie, me, and I see Umar too. Thank you. We'll be brief. Thank you, Latoya.
No worries. All right. So Teresa, why don't you moderate the rest of the comments? You know all the folks who are.
Yes. So Bonnie's next.